Hello, my name is Sharon Bown. I am a registered nurse of 25 years, 16 years of which I have spent as a nursing officer in the Royal Australian Air Force. As a nurse, I have enjoyed a career in which I have been able to assist individuals, families and communities to rise in adversity and to navigate survival even when the odds seemed stacked against them, and in many cases to find opportunity and growth in unimaginable cases of change and challenge. The motto of the Royal Australian Air Force is per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. And that has always been and continues to be a driving motivation for me. I have witnessed and studied the human experience of trauma for almost 3 decades. But the greatest lessons that I have learned have not come from lectures or textbooks, but from my own personal experience of trauma. And that is what I would like to share with you here today. In the past, when I have spoken to audiences about trauma, I have acknowledged that each and every one of them has experienced some form of trauma in their lives. And by virtue of the fact that they are sitting in my audience, they have risen in that adversity and overcome their own personal trauma. Today, though, I want to acknowledge that we are all currently experiencing a period of significant adversity, the global coronavirus pandemic. It is creating crises in health and economic proportions, the likes of which we have never seen before. But let us acknowledge that whilst we are all in the same storm at the moment, none of us is actually in the same boat. Our experience of adversity, of trauma, of challenge and change is unique to each of us. So whilst I will share my story with you today, I want you to reflect on your own experience. I want you to consider the trauma that you have already overcome in your lives and how you have managed to do that. Not unlike many other registered nurses, I decided to enter the profession because I wanted to make a difference in the lives of others. I didn't want for fame nor fortune. I simply wanted to make somebody else's life better for me having been in it. At just 23 years of age, having worked as a nurse for 3 years in Hobart, I had the earth-shattering realisation that I now had the skills, the knowledge and the experience to go out and save the world. I had the best of intentions, of course, but in my view, any individual in this world that was not as safe, secure and as privileged as I was somehow in need of my assistance. I would learn that these people across the world, in their experience of adversity, would give me so much more than I could ever give them. So in January 1999, I joined the Royal Australian Air Force. As I said, I served for 16 years, enjoying postings up and down the east coast of Australia, enjoying overseas operational deployments, including East Timor, Afghanistan and Bali after the second Bali bombings. Within 12 months of signing up, I was in Dili, East Timor, working as an operating theatre nurse in the United Nations Military Hospital. I was changing and saving lives, and I was falling in love with my job. It was here in East Timor that I decided that being a nursing officer in the Royal Australian Air Force was everything that I wanted to do with my life. My mother expected that I would serve out my initial engagement of 3 years, get this crazy world-saving fantasy out of my head, and go home, get married and have babies. Sadly for her, that would not be the case. I loved my job. It was exactly what I wanted to do with my life. And I intended that I would retire as an old nurse in the Royal Australian Air Force. 4 years later, in 2004, I was again deployed to East Timor, this time as an aeromedical evacuation nurse. I was young, I was fit, I was healthy. I was living my dream job. Life couldn't get any better, but sadly, it could get much worse. On the 2nd of June 2004, the noble life that I thought that I would lead was suddenly taken from me. And at this point, I want to stop and read to you from my memoir, my memory of that day. I loved to fly, particularly the low altitude flight of a helicopter, and I always sat as close to the doors as I could to enjoy the view. Why I didn't sit next to the door on that particular day, I don't know. But I would learn that this simple change in action might have saved my life. I had strapped the AME Thomas pack, a heavy backpack containing medical supplies, into the seat to the right of me. The AME doctor occupied the seat to the right of that. Seated to his right was the rescue crewman, Greg. I plugged my flying helmet's headset into the intercom system, grateful that in this particular aircraft I would have comms for the entire flight and I would be able to communicate with the rest of the crew. The mood aboard was friendly and jovial as we lifted off into the sky above Dili, and my thoughts quickly returned to the patient we had been called to evacuate. It was 15:10 hours on 2nd of June 2004. We headed south towards Same, which was on the other side of the steep mountain range that formed the backbone of the long but narrow island. The pregnant woman for whom we were en route was receiving medical assistance at the Same clinic from the local doctors. I listened as the aircrew discussed how they would make their approach to the village and noted that the weather around the mountain range may prolong our flight or even prevent our access, as the mountain range and the gaps through which the aircraft could fly appeared to be obscured by low cloud and rain. Soon, vision reduced significantly, and it was difficult to see the ground. It began to rain and rivulets of water danced on the perspex windows of the helicopter, smashed by the rotor wash and slipstream. I knew that the pilots were having a hard time transiting the mountains as I listened to them coming up with plans to find a gap through which to navigate. We attempted 2 separate crossings, but each was thwarted by the rapidly deteriorating weather. The pilots decided to try a 3rd route and even discussed a 4th contingency. I remember seeing the windscreen wipers flicking across the canopy glass and wondering how the pilots could see. I peered through the window of the cargo door and saw nothing but rain and cloud. This would make the village very difficult to locate. We finally crossed the mountains and headed toward the village. We made 2 approaches to try to find the village. The 3rd attempt revealed a break in the cloud and we could see the ground and the outline of a small riverbed. I could hear the aircrew were familiar with this riverbed and they agreed to attempt to follow it. I had not been to Same before and was not familiar with the landmarks being discussed. The helicopter was manoeuvred through 2 downward spiralling descents. I could now see the ground and it remained visible to me through the side doors. The rain got heavier, severely hampering visibility through the front windscreen. I again watched the windscreen wipers working feverishly. Even now, so many years later, the sound of heavy rain drags me back to this moment. The rescue crewman had opened the right-hand door to get better visibility of the ground. The rain was streaming through the open door. I was not concerned for my own safety, as I was aware that the crew was working very hard, and I thought that we simply might not reach Same. My concern was for the patient whose life may be depending upon our arrival. The pilots attempted a third spiralling but wider descent. Looking back, this seemed to be when we may have passed the point of no return. On the intercom, a male voice yelled, "We're going in. Brace, brace, brace." We're what? Brace means to assume the crash position. I had trained to respond to such words, but hearing them I felt the briefest moment of disbelief. Through the front windscreen I could now see that we were racing toward the trees. There was something very wrong. We were in dire trouble. Suddenly visibility appeared clear, which meant we were really close to the trees and now flying toward the ground. I followed my training. I leaned forward, crossed my arms across the front of my shins, and grabbed my ankles. Mayday, mayday. This was it. So sudden, so surreal, so powerless to alter the rapid change of course my life was about to take. The aircrew speedily followed their drills as we in the back sat motionless, waiting, helpless. I gripped my ankles harder and held myself firm as the world rushed past me. I was overwhelmed by fear as I accepted that I was about to die, and if I didn't, I was certainly about to break. My life didn't flash before my eyes, but in an instant I thought of my loved ones, and I knew that they would all survive this. Only Conway would be left alone. Despite the fear, I felt a calming peace and a deep sorrow for Conway. He was the last person in my life that I had spoken to, and he was the one who would be left to deal with this alone. It was a feeling for which there was no peace. I knew that in a profoundly cruel way, I was about to hurt the people I loved the most, and there was nothing that I could do to stop it from happening. My final memory of this moment was of the most intense fear intermingled with intense sorrow. Silently, I apologised to the man I loved, and the light of the world turned black. We were on a routine mission to rescue a woman in obstructed labour. We were supposed to be her saviours, but on that day we crashed into her tiny mountain village, and we required rescue and saving alongside her. My spine was crushed, my jaw was shattered, and my mind was so overwhelmed with fear that I would eventually be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I was just 29 years old. 3 days later, in the Royal Women's Hospital in Brisbane, I suffered a pulmonary embolus and a respiratory arrest. I may have been safely back in Australia, but I was still fighting for my life. Thanks to the effort of an amazing team of nurses and doctors, I was resuscitated and I woke up in the intensive care unit. These were the early and most intense days of my survival, and without realising it or understanding it, it was during this time that I adjusted my mindset to one of survival. I vowed that no matter what the world would throw at me next, I would be a survivor of my circumstances and never a victim. I'm not entirely sure why I made such a conscious decision, but I do know, in hindsight, that it allowed me to shift my mindset from one of dwelling in loss and grief to one of progress, a decision that enabled me to not only survive, but to continue to live. I encourage you to pause the video at this point and write that down. Take a screenshot on your computer or take a picture with your phone. I will be a survivor, never a victim. I will be a survivor and never a victim. Why am I emphasizing this point? I'm not trying to sell you some positive mantra, but I realized that my mindset was crucial to my survival. I realized that my mindset was essential in overcoming adversity. Deciding that I would be a survivor and never a victim set me on a trajectory of progress and opportunity, and not one that would allow me to dwell in my grief. I also learnt that mindset is contagious, and we've all experienced this, whether it's at home with our families or at work with our colleagues. That person that walks into the room and lights up everybody's day. No matter how bad your day may be, they somehow make you feel better. And then there's that other person that we all know. The one that seems to be able to bring the mood down. The one who, after having a conversation with us, makes us feel exhausted, drained, unable to see the way ahead, that everything is a problem and there are no solutions. So please remember, mindset is contagious. It's something to be aware of in yourself, but also, particularly during this difficult time, within your teams. Contagious mindset was incredibly important for me because despite my optimism, I was employed in an organisation that was based on capability, the Australian Defence Force. And many of my colleagues had decided that the nature of my injuries was so severe that my career was over. They had already made that decision for me. I had to change their mind. I had fought for my life, and now I had to fight for my job. It was a time in the Australian Defence Force where it was simply easier to administer my medical discharge than it would be to arrange and facilitate a rehabilitation program. I needed to change that process. But I knew that despite the challenges ahead, I was not ready to give up the career that I loved. I still wanted to be able to care for others. And so I fought for the privilege to continue to serve. Not merely to serve my country, but as a nursing officer to serve the men, women and families of the Australian Defence Force. The individuals who gave me the motivation to get out of bed every day, to be better, to be stronger, to advocate for them in a healthcare system that they didn't always understand, and sadly, which didn't always understand them. I needed to take what I had learnt in my adversity and use it to still make the lives of others better for me having been in them. We can't always overcome adversity simply. There is no magic solution, but there is opportunity in our adversity, and leadership is one of those incredible opportunities. Who are you leading? Your team? Your family? What about the individuals that walk through your shop door every day? We don't know what their stories are. We don't know what adversity they might be facing. But their interaction with you, your leadership in your community, may make all of the difference for them. I fought for my career. I fought to stay in the Australian Defence Force and continue to serve. And within 12 months, I won that fight. But trauma had changed me. My ability to make a difference in the lives of others, to provide nursing care, had changed as a result of my experience of adversity. My first deployment following my injuries was to Bali to provide an aeromedical evacuation response following the second Bali bombings. I realised on that airfield in Bali that I now had an empathy for Australians injured overseas that I couldn't have possibly understood before. I had been injured overseas, and I knew that despite the clinical interventions that I could provide, what these Australians needed from me was the reassurance that they were safe and that we would take them home. I cared for a woman on that airfield in Bali who would have been the age of my own mother. She had been on holiday with her husband, no doubt after an entire career of hard work and saving, and she was simply out for dinner when she was injured in a terrorist bomb blast. I knew from my experience that what she needed was to feel cared for, to feel safe, and to know the comfort of home. I realised that I didn't need a formal qualification to make a difference there. Human connection is a capability within all of us. So let's recap. How did I get from being that young, fit nurse in East Timor, loving life, to an ICU bed fighting for my life, to here, speaking to you today? Well, many of the military and clinical audiences that I speak to like acronyms. It's not always the way that I like to work, but I've come up with an acronym to help you to rise in adversity. Recognition, intention, strategy, and evolution. Recognition as a first step, our ability to recognise that we are actually experiencing adversity, that we are in a period of challenge and change. Unless we can recognise that, we are unable to address it. Intention, having recognised that we are in a period of adversity, what do we intend to do about it? And here I share with you a quote from my favourite philosopher, Dr. Seuss. When something bad happens, you have three choices. Let it define you, let it destroy you, or let it strengthen you. And the third step is strategy. Recognising our adversity, having set our intention, how are we actually going to achieve that? What are the steps involved? What resources do we need? And in those resources, who are the people that we wish to surround ourselves with? Remember that mindset is contagious. Who is going to carry us through to the next step? The next step being evolution. At the moment, this might seem a long way off. But again, recognising adversity, setting the intention of what we wish to achieve, and coming up with a strategy to achieve that, eventually we come out the other side, having grown in this period of adversity and change. These steps have the ability to bring us to what the American researchers Calhoun and Tedeschi describe as post-traumatic growth. The experience of positive change that the individual experiences as a result of the struggle with a traumatic event. The important word in that definition is struggle. In order for us to grow in adversity, we endure a struggle, and from that struggle, we learn. Returning to the thought that you don't need a formal qualification to make a difference, and that human connection is a capability within all of us, this became evident to me once more during my command in a theatre of war in Afghanistan. My team and I were embedded in a Dutch health facility, a Dutch hospital in Tarin Kowt, Afghanistan. We were providing critical care support to coalition forces. Afghanistan was the ultimate test of my abilities as a commander, as an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force, and as a nurse. It would take everything I had ever learnt, everything I had ever witnessed and experienced to be able to survive in this environment and provide the care that was necessary. But again, I would learn that it would not just be the clinical interventions that would make a difference. It would be my ability to form those human connections, to be with someone when they needed me the most. My team and I were co-located with the Australian Special Forces, and to acknowledge our presence, they presented us with an Australian flag. I knew why they had Australian flags in their supplies, and they weren't as gifts for Australian healthcare teams. They were to be used to drape the coffins of Australian soldiers. I knew how significant this gift was, and that this Australian flag needed to be used in the most appropriate way. So as the commander, I decided that the Australian national flag would be hung on the wall of our operating theatre. I wanted to ensure that when an Australian soldier came into our care, that when they were laying on the bed in our operating theatre, the last thing that they would see before going to sleep would be their flag, and the last thing that they would hear would be our shocking Australian accents. I knew the importance of ensuring that in this tiny little armoured corner of the war, they could experience some sense of home, some comfort that Australia was there with them. Now I know that my stories are dramatic, but I want to reassure you that without the theories, without the acronyms, the motivational speakers, and all of this positive psychology of which I speak, you each have the ability to rise in adversity. You have each overcome significant challenges and changes in your own lives. For those of you in small business, you know there are incredible stressors that you have overcome to be here today. Stressors that I have never had to experience. Our experience of adversity, of challenge, change, trauma, they're all unique to each of us. You don't need to have been the survivor of a helicopter crash or the commander in a theatre of war to understand adversity. And whilst I have shared my experience of the more dramatic adversities in my life, there have been many times where I have had to revisit that 4-step acronym. The injuries sustained in that helicopter crash in East Timor would eventually lead to the end of my Air Force career. I would no longer have the privilege of serving in uniform. So I had to reinvent myself. I needed to find a way to be able to continue to serve without the uniform. I revisited my RISE acronym. I wrote a book, which I found to be an incredibly therapeutic process, but which also enabled others to share in my story and to navigate their own survival. I became an unintentional advocate for Australian veterans, particularly those injured in the course of their service. And this naive young perioperative nurse from Hobart, who had set out to save the world, now sits on one of the most prestigious boards in the country, the Council of the Australian War Memorial. So never underestimate your ability to rise in adversity. I know that times are incredibly difficult right now, and it may be difficult to see the way ahead. But I hope that no matter how dark it gets, that you can reflect on my story and realise that you are capable of overcoming this. I hope that I provide living proof that there is life beyond challenge, and that no matter the challenges that lay ahead for you now, that you will survive, thrive, and continue to live to the greatest of your capability. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and I sincerely wish you all the very best in the future.